In this video, we're going to learn how to install and configure Elasticsearch. Throughout this video, we'll be talking about Elasticsearch 6 and how we can get it running on a CentOS 7 based Linux system. We'll look at some configuration files. We'll update them to make sure the proper memory settings are used to match Elastic's guidance. We'll talk about some important file locations, and we'll do a quick verification that Elasticsearch is indeed running using its built-in API. Throughout the course, we'll focus on a Linux-based platform running CentOS 7. When you install Elasticsearch, you have a few choices. You can install it via the Yum package, which is a HTTP-based hosted file system that Elastic has, where you can pull down the latest files or the latest packages for Elasticsearch at any point in time. Or you can install via an RPM, which is more of the manual way of installing. I prefer to install via the RPM, so I have tighter control over what version of the software gets run at any point in time. That way a rogue system administrator can't run Yum update and completely mess up my Elastic cluster. This is the last slide we'll see, because we're going to jump onto the operating system. But throughout this setup, we'll be looking at the sysconfig configuration file for Elasticsearch. We'll be looking at etc Elasticsearch / Elasticsearch YAML to configure some Elasticsearch settings. We'll create a new file path that will have all of our Elasticsearch data go to, and I'll show you what the logs look like. One of the big guidances you see from Elasticsearch is to use 50% of the memory that is available to the system. Our development machine here that we'll be running has 16 gigabytes of RAM, so we'll set Elasticsearch to use 8 of them. First thing we need to do is install Java, since Elasticsearch requires Java 8 to run. We'll run yum install openjdk-devel. This will give us a full Java development kit. As you can see, I've already installed it on this system, so we'll be good to go. Next, we'll download the Elasticsearch RPM. If we go to the Installing Elasticsearch page at Elastic, we can follow the instructions to install Elasticsearch via the RPM. On this page, they show you how you can set up the RPM or the Yum repo to use. But here's what I want. I want to download using wget Elasticsearch 6 RPM. So we'll take that wget command and we'll run it here to download the file. When it's done, we'll verify that it came down and we'll run the RPM installation. As the instructions show, we want to make sure that sysv knows about the Elasticsearch config files, and we want to make sure using system control that the Elasticsearch service will start on boot. First thing we want to do before we install Elasticsearch is update the memory configuration. Here, we'll go to etc Elasticsearch. As root, we'll go to etc Elasticsearch, and we'll edit the Elasticsearch YAML file. We can set a cluster name for later use. This will help us tie together multiple nodes when we add it. We can set a node name for this one, and we'll ignore the other things. We will set up this new path. I want to set a custom path of Elastic data. And we'll see logs will come out to var log Elasticsearch. Those are good. Those are the things we want. Now we do also want to set the memory configuration like I said earlier. It's in etc sysconfig Elasticsearch. Here we have the Elasticsearch home where the RPM installed the file to, and the Java home. Now that we've set some basic configuration items, let's update the memory usage from Elasticsearch. It's in etc Elasticsearch jvm.options. Here you can see the default heap size for Java is set to 1 gig to start and max. So we'll update that to be 8 gigabytes. Now, we need to create the root system, the file system for Elasticsearch, where I want all of our data to go. Now let's figure out what user Elasticsearch runs as. We can peek into etc password to see what the username is and what group it is. So we can see it's Elasticsearch. So we'll change the owner to Elasticsearch and the group to Elasticsearch of that data path. And now we'll run Elastic. We can verify that it's running by checking all the processes on the system. And we can see Elasticsearch is indeed running. We'll go to its log path and see that the packet Elastic6 and see that the packed Elastic6 log files are being created. We can print out the log file to show that everything is started. Our cluster looks good, and it's listening for other Elasticsearch nodes on the network. See that here. We'll get into master, slave, and data nodes later, but you can see that since this is a single node in the cluster, it elected itself as master. Now if we look in the Elastic data path, we'll see some setup information for nodes, since this is node 0, and other state information. We don't have any indexes created, but we haven't talked about those yet. Now what I want to do is show you some of this basic API. So I've made some quick scripts. I've made some quick scripts. We can get cluster information by running a curl command. Curl get localhost 9200. 9200 is the default port that Elasticsearch runs on. We'll call it cluster API, and we want the health information. Let's run that by hand, and I'll show you what we get. That's not readable. Let's do that again and add the pretty parameter. Now we get some formatted JSON. So we can see that our cluster name is packed elastic 6 like we set it up. The status is green, which is always good. We have one node, we have one data node. We have no shards, we'll get into what those are later, because we have no data indexed. After we get cluster information, we can get cluster statistics. Again, it's a curl-based API to call this cluster stats. You get a lot more information here around the JVM, the number of processes, how much memory used, information about the host OS, all kinds of stuff. So now that we've verified our network ports and we've pinged our API to get information and shown cluster information, we're done for today. In our next video, we'll install and configure Kibana so we can start to visualize some of this information.